The first reading is from the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, beginning at verse 25, going on to chapter 5, verse 2. Ephesians was not a book that was first included by the church fathers in the first version of the New Testament. That's because it was a circular letter that was sent by Paul, the apostle, to the elders in Colossia. Now, Colossia was a church that had a lot of problems in terms of some of the members of the church introducing ideas which are not the fundamental doctrine of the Christian church. So Paul wrote to them to bring them back to focus. And in fact, Ephesians is very much similar in concept to the second half of the book of Colossians. So this circular letter, because it was not addressed to the people in Ephesia, it was not recognized as a letter or a book in the New Testament. But later it was corrected and it became part of it. Now, the important thing about this book is essentially Paul, having experienced what happened in Colossia, also wanted all the other churches to remember what is the center and focus of our faith. He wanted to emphasize the Trinity, and he also wanted to give them a guideline of spiritual morality and social ethics, and which was bound together in the love of Jesus Christ. So he starts off with the central theme of the Christian faith: God's love, His Son Jesus, who came to redeem us, and the Holy Spirit He promised for all of us. So with that in mind, we will now read what is said in this particular segment of the Bible. It was a set of rules for a new life. Okay. It says, "So then, putting away falsehood, let us all of us speak the truth to our neighbors. We are members of one another. Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not make room for the devil. Thieves must give up stealing, rather let them labor and work honestly with their own hands, so as to have something to share with the needy. Let no evil talk come out of your mouths, but only what is useful for building up as there is need, so that your words may give grace to all those who hear. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with which you are marked with a seal for the day of redemption. Put away from you all bitterness and wrath and anger and wrangling and slander, and stand together with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ has forgiven you. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and live in the love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant and sacrifice of God." Here ends the reading of this word. The word of God. Thanks be to God.
Our second reading this morning is from the book of Nehemiah, chapter 2, verses 17 through 20. Listen for the word of God. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates are burned. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, so that we may no longer suffer disgrace." I told them that the hand of God had been gracious upon me, and also the words that the king had spoken to me. Then they said, "Let us start building." So they committed themselves to the common good. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they mocked and ridiculed us, saying, "What is this that you are doing? Are you rebuilding against the king?" Then I replied to them, "The God of heaven is the one who will give us success, and we, his servants, are going to start building. But you have no share or claim or historic right in Jerusalem." This is the word of the Lord. So, this is not the lectionary for this week. I'm continuing Dale's summer series on books that we rarely talk about in church. So he's been talking for a couple weeks about Ezra, and Nehemiah is kind of a companion book to Ezra. They're kind of contemporaries. They're part of the same story, where the Israelites, Moses led them out of Egypt. He led them to the Promised Land. They founded this kingdom. They had this golden age where they were kind of the kings of the hill, the big guys on the block. And then it all came to an end. They were invaded. The walls were torn down, the temple was destroyed, and all their people were taken into exile. At this point in history, some new leadership has come into power, and a lot of these Israelites are being allowed to return to Jerusalem, to return to their homeland. And when they come back, they find this ruin. So Dale talked for a couple weeks about Ezra. He kind of reestablished the religious law. He rebuilt the temple of God. Nehemiah had a different calling. If you kind of know one thing about Nehemiah, like I said in Sunday school, the one thing I knew is Nehemiah built the wall. Ezra built the temple, Nehemiah built the wall. But I think even that's not really common knowledge. I did a very unofficial, unscientific survey yesterday at breakfast it composed two decades-long churchgoers, very active in their church, and one Methodist pastor, what they knew about Nehemiah, and they didn't know all that much. So, brief summary. Nehemiah was in exile. He had this job as the cupbearer of a king, and I always mess this name up, Artaxerxes. He was the cupbearer, which probably meant he was very trusted, because if you wanted to get to the king, one of the people that you try to get on your side is the guy who brings him his drink every single day. That was a pretty easy avenue to knock off the ruler. So it's a very trusted position. He spent all day with the king, so the king must have liked him. He had the ear of the king, so he was doing pretty well for himself. And he hears about the plight of Jerusalem. He hears about his countrymen coming back and finding this ruin. The walls torn down, there's rubble everywhere. And he hears that his people are in despair. And it breaks his heart, to the point where the king says, "Nehemiah, you're looking super sad. Normally you're happy. What is going on?" And he tells the king what's going on with his people. And the king says, "Well, what would you like to do?" He says, "With your permission, I would like to go back and help them rebuild." The king not only gives him permission, he lets him he gives him a draft to take money and lumber from the storehouses. He gives him some soldiers to escort him back to his home. And when Nehemiah gets there, this is one of my favorite parts of the book, he doesn't come in and be like, "I'm back, this is going to happen." He goes out secretly during the night and he surveys all the wall and all the gates, kind of like a little ninja. He surveys the lay of the land, he sees firsthand what's actually going on, and then he decides what needs to be done. He says, we're going to build a wall. Which kind of leads to a question. Why build the wall? Why is this the first thing he feels needs to be done? Not clean up the streets or kind of fix up some of these houses or, I don't know, like put together some trade. He says the first thing we need to do is a wall. And I've read some different ideas about this. One thing is a wall back then, that was a military fortification. Walls these days are more kind of decorative. But back then a wall was, a military defense. If you had a wall around it, it was a lot harder for people to come in and attack you. So it was a way of saying, we're back. We're out of exile, we're here, and watch out. I'm not convinced by that theory. I mean, the main thing is the wall didn't do them much good a couple decades before. So why would this wall kind of put together by these refugees, made mainly out of rubble, have more of an effect? I think the wall was a symbol. Walls can be a lot of different things. Walls can keep things in, like the walls of a prison or a zoo. Walls can keep people out. Walls can be used to beautify something. Walls can be decorative. For the Israelites, the wall was a symbol. It was one thing Jerusalem was known for, its great wall that stretched around this huge city with its huge gates. It was a symbol of their nation, of their people's pride. It was a symbol of their identity, which was something you could imagine that these people might be in need of. They hadn't just all been in exile together, they had been scattered. Their best and brightest were taken to all these different courts, given all these different jobs. Some were taken off, and then some were kind of left behind. Some escaped and fled, and were kind of living on their own in exile. So, building a wall was kind of rebuilding their identity. I can also imagine that it's also a very visible symbol for the people returning home. I just imagine them kind of like all of a sudden the city comes into view and the first thing they see is that wall. There were some people coming home who had never been there before. Maybe they'd heard stories about Jerusalem. And imagine how much different it is to come home and see this thing that you had heard so much about instead of a ruin. I think most important, though, the wall of the city was something they could all work on together. And it was something that belonged to all of them. If they started on rebuilding homes or even like areas of the city, you kind of have to pick, well, whose area gets rebuilt first? This was something that belonged to all of them. All these people coming home, it was something they worked on together, side by side. In a way, they were rebuilding their community. They were rebuilding something that they could look at the end and say, we did this. We did this together. Every single one of us had a part of this, and now it belongs to all of us. It wasn't always easy. As we saw in this passage, there's a lot of people who did not like Nehemiah coming in and kind of taking charge. And they threw a lot of obstacles in his way. But as I talked about in the children's message, the one thing Nehemiah is known for more than anything else is that he kept working. if you read through the book, you see all the problems he had and all the ways he dealt with them. And I've done Bible studies with this, where we kind of went through each one and the clever things he did. But the big thing is, sometimes they had to work a little slower. Sometimes they had to change the way they were working, but they never stopped. They stopped for nothing. The other thing Nehemiah was known for was taking care of his people. It's kind of a side note, but I think it's an important one for his character. Unlike previous governor, he was elected governor of the community here. Unlike previous ones, he didn't take his salary. And in fact, he actually fed, the Bible says, 150 people every day from his own table. He was a servant of the people. But what does this mean for us? Nehemiah had a great calling. He had people in need. We don't really need a wall. In fact, some people believe that we maybe need less walls today. That we actually don't need to build walls. Maybe we need to tear some down. I read that, I did a children's message on that New Testament passage last week at Amanda's church. And it talks about words tearing down and words building things up. It reminded me of this, one of my favorite books. It's called The Phantom Toll Booth. It was written by a gentleman named Norton Juster. And it's basically about this young boy named Milo who finds the world boring. He's not interested in anything, and he finds himself in this land filled with puns and allegories. And he comes across this valley, and as soon as he goes into it, he finds he can't talk. And in fact, he can't make any noise at all. He's not making any footsteps. There's no rustling. It's completely silent. And he meets the people, and he's told that nearby there's a fortress where a woman lives called the Soundkeeper. And basically, she became distressed at how people seem to become more and more interested in making ugly noises and ugly sounds and not beautiful sounds. So she decided they didn't deserve them, and she took them all away. And they were all locked up in her fortress. So the people asked Milo for help. They said all they needed was him to smuggle one sound out of the fortress, and they could use it to take down the walls. So he goes to visit the Soundkeeper, and she gives him a tour, and in the fortress he finds he can talk and everything is normal again. As he's leaving, he's trying to convince her to help out the people in town, that they're sorry, they realize what they did wrong. But she doesn't trust them. And he's about to continue his argument, and he's about to say, and he realizes that there's a brief moment between when he makes the word and it escapes his mouth, and that by clamping down his lips, he can hold that word in his mouth. So he quickly shakes her hand and leaves as fast as he can. He gets back to the town people, and they bring out this giant cannon, and he crawls up this big ladder, and he leans over, and he whispers, and he lets his word into the cannon. So he opens his mouth, and the word, "but," comes out. So they aim it, and they pull the thing, and there's this huge cloud of smoke, but all you hear is this little word, "but." And all of a sudden there's this rumbling, and the walls of the fortress come down. I thought of that because that always struck me, that image of this tiny word bringing down these great walls of this fortress. As that passage in Ephesians says, words can tear things down. Words can also build things up. Our actions can tear things down, or they build things up. And as Paul writes in there, as Christians, we should always be looking to build things up. We're not called to build a wall, but we are called to build community. We're called to build bonds and connections with each other and with those outside our church. I firmly believe that a fundamental part of being a Christian is being in community. I sometimes hear people say, "Oh, I don't go to church, but that's okay. I have the Bible and I pray, so I read and I spend my personal Jesus time, and then that's good enough." But I think that's missing a huge part of the gospel. A fundamental part of our call as Christians is to be in community with each other and with others, to be in the world, working in the world. So we're not called to build a wall, but we are called to build, like Nehemiah, a community. So in that sense, every day we're on that wall. Every day God calls us to build bonds, to work, to build things up, to help others. And every day, like Nehemiah, we're giving excuses to lay down that burden. We're given reasons. Oh, it's not safe. It might not be, you're kind of making people upset. There's more interesting things you could be working on. Oh, you're tired today. Everybody's tired today. And Nehemiah said, that's fine, we can rest. We'll work slower, but we're still going to work. Every day we have this call. Every day we have more than enough reasons to lay down the burden. But every day we can hear the words of Nehemiah. I've been given this work of God. I cannot stop yet because the work is not yet completed. Nehemiah kept working until the work was completed. This is our charge, the charge of Nehemiah. And the hard thing for us is that the work is never completed. We can never lay down our burden. Every day we have to try to be helping people, look into ways to build and expand and strengthen our community, the bonds of friendship, the relationships with each other, and the relationship with Christ. This is our charge. And while we can never lay it down, it is a joyful task. It is a wonderful responsibility that we have been trusted with. And we should rejoice in it. We should take pride in it. For it is part of our identity. It is part of our home. It's part of who we are. Amen.